Okay, we are grateful and we are all here, and welcome everybody. As I said before, we spoke in Hebrew for a few minutes. This is the session today, the panel on the subject of the Arab Spring from the Israeli window, so to speak. And as my introductory remarks will make clear, we're here to explore some important questions regarding the implications of the events unfolding in the Middle East vis-à-vis Israel, but even beyond. And let me have my early remarks to set the tone for this, and then I'll introduce the panel discussing. The events of the last 4 months have been so remarkable and defied so many conventional wisdom that they have left many of us in a state of awe. No one could say with any certainty where these tremendous events are leading. Certainly, the free world has been inspired by the willingness of so many Arab peoples who had been subjected to despotism and tyranny to break down the barriers of fear, putting their own lives in jeopardy in the process. From Benghazi to the Tahrir Square, from Dara to Tunisia, we have witnessed something which reminds many of us, especially those old enough, of the great movements of freedom of the second half of the last century. In Tunisia, the images of Muhammad Bouazizi burning himself in protest unmistakably recall the Spring of Prague in 1968 and the young Czech Jan Palach who set himself on fire. And yet, when we view these dramatic events, particularly from the Western as well as Israeli perspective, we must think through and delicate balance the need to push forward positive developments while cautiously guarding against the possible benevolent and unintended consequences of great political upheavals. We have difficulty balancing between idealism and realities, morality and realpolitik, rights and inspiration of people, and the chaos that often results from these. The so-called third wave of democratic transitions in the 80s and 90s, bringing democratic changes in Latin America, Southern Europe, and the formerly communist countries, as well as in Asia, bypassed the Arab world. There, with just a few exceptions, stagnation, corruption, and repression continued unabated or even increased. This reality has persuaded some observers that Islam must be the problem. Democracy and Islam, many have argued, are incompatible. The electoral victories of Islamists in Algeria in 1991 and eventually in Gaza in 2006 helped fuel the notion that Arab democracy would at best be a cover-up for populist Islamic takeovers. September 11th, meanwhile, seemed to prove that there was indeed what Huntington called a clash of civilization between the West and radical Islam. Here in Israel, many have been skeptical about the prospects of democratic Middle East, which lives in peace with Israel. While some of our leaders constantly call for democratic Middle East as a prerequisite for peace, they often seem reluctant to believe in its possibility. This anxiety, born of history and experience, continued to influence minds and heart among Israelis. Inspiration, real enough, has been commingled with fear of what might come. The early experiences of the Arab Spring indeed prove that any transition to democracy will not be straightforward, if ever. And yet, when Israelis adopt a cautious posture, they are, rightfully or wrongly, accused of hypocrisy. How could you, the so-called sole democracy in the Middle East, oppose the march of democracy elsewhere? I've been asked time and again. This argument has some curious resonance or distortions elsewhere in the Middle East. Among some Arab, one hears the argument that the so-called or fictional Israeli democracy will be drowned by true populist and Arab democracy. The recent border transgressions are in this light seen as a march for freedom. But this is our difficult situation that calls for difficult decision, which balance both heart and mind, neither ignoring the other. How to arrive at this delicate balance? How to encourage freedom while warding off its worst excesses? These are questions of the greatest difficulty, which the Americans, for example, seem to be perplexed by. In order to gain some perspective, I am delighted, with many of us, to host our distinguished panel. Bernard-Henri Lévy, as you might be aware, has played some role in the unfolding of these events, especially in Libya. Lévy, always an inflammable and eloquent defender of human rights, has been on the ground in Libya and Egypt, and with his unique blend of theoretical and practical insights can help us ruminate on these problems. Our own Ms. Tzipi Livni, head of Kadima and the opposition, has been courageously wrestling with these issues in her dealing with the Palestinians, where she has been trying to walk the fine line between idealism and reality. And last but not least, our friend Etan Brunner of the New York Times, with an astonishing record as a journalist and writer, will introduce our panel. He himself, as you know, is a world-renowned and most insightful observer of Israeli and Middle East affairs. And we are very honored and delighted to have all of you amongst us. Please welcome our guests today.